The workshop manager hired a cleaner without knowing that he was an unemployed mechanic. Then, the midday sun beat down relentlessly on Hernandez's auto repair shop, located on a bustling corner in Guadalajara. The smell of burnt oil and hot metal permeated the air, mingling with the constant noise of wrenches banging against stubborn engines. Roberto Hernandez, a robust 52-year-old man with hands weathered by 30 years of work, looked with frustration at the black Chevrolet Suburban that had been occupying the main bay of his workshop for 3 weeks. "Damn piece of junk," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag. 3 weeks and neither Chewy nor the fat guy have been able to find out what the hell is wrong with it. The vehicle belonged to Don Armando Villalobos, one of the most important businessmen in the area, owner of a chain of restaurants that stretched throughout Jalisco. The man had been clear. He needed his truck running by Friday when he had to travel to Puerto Vallarta to close an important deal. But the engine was stalling for no apparent reason, and none of his mechanics had been able to diagnose the problem. Roberto walked to his small office where the ceiling fan spun lazily, failing to cool the room. On his desk lay a pile of unpaid bills and a cup of cold coffee from the morning. He slumped into his chair with a heavy sigh. Business had not been going well lately. He had lost 2 important clients the previous month because his jobs took too long, and now this. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in." He grunted without looking up. The door opened and a thin man of about 35 entered, his black hair perfectly combed back and his dark eyes conveying a mixture of determination and weariness. He was wearing worn but clean jeans and a light blue short-sleeved shirt. In his hands, he held a baseball cap, which he fiddled with nervously. "Good morning, sir. I'm here for the cleaning job," the man said in a firm but respectful voice. "I saw the ad on the pole on the corner." Roberto looked up and studied him for a few seconds. He had put up that ad a week ago after his former cleaner decided to go to work in the United States with a cousin. He needed someone to keep the workshop presentable, to sweep the floor full of metal shavings and oil stains, to organize the tools and take out the trash. Nothing complicated, but essential to maintaining a minimum of order in the daily chaos. "What's your name?" Roberto asked, sitting up straight in his seat. "Miguel Angel Soto, sir, but everyone calls me Miguel. Do you have cleaning experience, Miguel?" Miguel hesitated for just a second before answering. "I've worked in several places, sir. I know how to keep things tidy and clean. I'm responsible and punctual. I won't let you down." There was something about the way Miguel spoke, a quiet confidence that was unusual in someone coming to apply for a cleaning job. Roberto noticed that the man's hands, although clean, were calloused and had small scars, the marks of someone accustomed to hard work. "The pay is modest," Roberto warned. 200 pesos a week, you start at 7 a.m. and finish at 5 p.m., Saturdays until noon. Are you interested?" "I'm interested, sir," Miguel replied without hesitation. "Good, you start tomorrow. Be on time." Miguel nodded, put on his cap, and turned to leave. Before crossing the door, he paused and looked back at the workshop, where the black SUV rested like an unsolved challenge. His eyes lingered on the vehicle for a few seconds longer than usual, but Roberto didn't notice, already busy checking the invoices on his desk. When Miguel left the workshop, he walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk of the avenue. The sun was still relentless, and the city traffic roared around him. Brightly painted buses, yellow taxis honking their horns, street vendors offering fresh fruit and hibiscus tea. He stopped in front of a Taco al Pastor stand and ordered 2 tacos and a soda in a glass bottle. As he ate, he watched the frenetic movement of Guadalajara, a city that never slept, where every corner told a different story. Miguel had arrived in Guadalajara 6 months earlier after losing his job as a specialized mechanic at a car dealership in Monterrey. The economic crisis had hit the automotive industry hard, and when the dealership decided to cut staff, he was one of the first to go. With a daughter to support and insufficient savings, he had made the difficult decision to leave her temporarily with his mother in Monterrey, while he sought to establish himself in another city. Since then, he had sent applications to more than 20 auto repair shops in Guadalajara. Some did not even respond, others told him there were no vacancies, and one offered him a job, but the salary was so low that it would barely cover his rent. Despair had begun to settle in his chest like a heavy stone. The money he had brought with him was running out quickly, And the small room he rented in a neighborhood in the Santa Terre district cost 3,000 pesos a month. He had seen the cleaning job advertisement at the Hernandez workshop while walking around looking for any opportunity. It wasn't what he wanted, it wasn't what he had studied or perfected during his 15-year career, but it was something. And at that moment, something was better than nothing. He finished his tacos, paid with the last coins he had in his pocket, and set off on the way back to his room. As he walked through the cobbled streets of the neighborhood, he thought of his 13-year-old daughter, Carolina. He missed her with a pain that tightened his chest. Every night they talked on the phone, and every night she asked him when he would come home. He always gave her the same answer. Soon, my love. Very soon. That night, lying on his narrow cot as the rusty fan spun above his head, Miguel closed his eyes and thought about the black Suburban outside the workshop. He had recognized the model immediately, a vehicle he had worked on dozens of times at the dealership, and something about the way it sat in that bay, with the hood slightly raised and tools scattered around it, told him that the problem was not as complicated as everyone thought. He fell asleep with that image in his mind, unaware that the next day he would embark on a journey that would change not only his life, but also the fate of the Hernandez workshop. Miguel arrived at the Hernandez workshop at exactly 7 a.m. The sky still retained the pink tones of dawn, and the streets of Guadalajara were beginning to wake up with the characteristic noise of metal shutters opening and the first street vendors setting up their stalls. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before, but they were perfectly clean and ironed. In his hand, he held a plastic bag with a thermos of coffee he had prepared in his room. Roberto was already at the workshop as usual. The boss was known for being the first to arrive and the last to leave. It was a trait his employees both admired and feared. Good morning, boss, Miguel greeted him as he entered. Good morning, Roberto replied without looking up from the engine he was examining. El Chuy will show you where the cleaning supplies are. He's my head mechanic. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jesus El Chuy Ramirez appeared, a burly 40-year-old man with tattooed arms and an unkempt beard that gave him a rough appearance. He wore grease-stained blue overalls and held a wrench so large it looked like a weapon. Are you the new cleaning guy? Chuy asked, looking Miguel up and down with a certain disdain. Yes, Mr. Miguel Angel Soto. I'm no Mr. Buddy, just Chuy, he said, and without waiting for a response, he motioned for Miguel to follow him. Come on, I'll show you where everything is. Miguel followed Chuy to the back of the workshop, where there was a small, messy room that served as a storage area. Inside were brooms, mops, buckets, industrial detergents, and a variety of cleaning products piled up in no apparent order. Here's everything you need, Chuy explained, pointing with his arm. You sweep the entire workshop twice a day, once in the middle of the morning and once before we close. You mop the areas where there is no machinery. You keep the tools we leave lying around organized, and every Friday you do a deep cleaning. Understood? Understood? Miguel replied with a nod. Oh, and one more thing, Chuy added, moving a little closer with a serious expression. Don't mess with the cars. Don't touch anything we're working on. Your job is just to clean. If you need to move something, ask us first. Sure, okay. Chuy patted him on the shoulder. Start by sweeping the entire work area. There are shavings everywhere. Miguel picked up a broom and began his work. For the first few hours, he concentrated on meticulously sweeping every corner of the workshop. There were metal shavings, loose screws, dirty rags, and oil stains everywhere. As he worked, he discreetly observed how the mechanics moved from one vehicle to another, how they discussed technical problems, how their expert hands handled tools with the precision of surgeons. Besides Chuy, there were two other mechanics in the workshop. Rodrigo, the fat one, Salazar, a robust and jovial man who always had a joke ready, and Javier, a 23-year-old who had just finished his technical training and was still learning the trade. The three worked with the constant background of regional Mexican music playing from an old dust-covered radio. Miguel Barria was standing near the black SUV when he overheard the conversation between Chuy and the fat man. We've been working on this truck for 3 weeks now, complained the fat man, wiping sweat from his brow with a howl. Don Armando is coming tomorrow, and we have nothing to tell him. We've already checked everything, buddy, Chuy replied, with obvious frustration. I changed the fuel filter, checked the pump, verified the entire electrical system. Everything is fine, but the engine keeps shutting down. And if it's the control module, we've already scanned it 3 times. It doesn't show any error codes. Miguel continued sweeping, but his ears were attentive to every word. He knew that problem. He had seen it before. That generation of Suburban had a known defect in the ignition system, specifically in the ignition coils. The problem was intermittent and didn't always generate error codes on the scanner. It required a specific test that many mechanics overlooked, but he bit his tongue and continued sweeping. It wasn't his place. It wasn't his job. He was there to clean, not to diagnose vehicles. At lunchtime, the mechanics went out to eat at a nearby restaurant that served homemade food. Miguel stayed in the workshop eating the 2 sandwiches he had prepared that morning and drinking tap water. As he ate, sitting on a bench near the entrance, his gaze inevitably turned to the Suburban. His curiosity was too strong. He approached the vehicle and, careful not to leave grease marks, opened the hood. The engine was clean, a sign that the mechanics had worked extensively on it. He looked at the connections, followed the wires with his eyes, and visually checked the ignition system. Everything seemed to be in order, but his experience told him that there was something else to check. He heard the sound of a door and quickly closed the hood. Roberto had left his office and was walking toward him. "Everything okay, Miguel?" asked the boss in a neutral tone. "Yes, sir. I was just admiring the vehicle." "It's a nice model," Miguel replied casually. "It's a headache." "That's what it is," Roberto grumbled. "But hey, that's not your problem. Are you done sweeping?" "Yes, sir. I've finished the first sweep. I'll do the second one at 3 o'clock. "Good. Keep it up." Roberto returned to his office and Miguel went back to work. But for the rest of the day, his mind kept thinking about the Suburban and possible solutions to the problem. That afternoon, when the mechanics had already left and only he and Roberto were left in the workshop, Miguel finished mopping the floor and put away the cleaning supplies. As he left, he passed by the SUV once again. This time, no one was watching him. He walked back to his room as the sun set behind the buildings of Guadalajara, painting the sky orange and purple. The streets were full of nightlife, corn vendors, families strolling, young people on street corners talking and laughing. Miguel felt like a ghost passing through all that vitality. Someone who didn't quite belong anywhere. That night, talking on the phone with Carolina, his daughter told him about a math test she had passed with a good grade. "I miss you, Dad," she said in a small voice. "When are you coming back?" "Soon, my love. I got a job. Things are going to get better. You'll see. It's a good job. Do they pay you well?" Miguel looked around his tiny room with peeling walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, dimly illuminating the space. "It's a good job," he lied softly, "and soon I'll be able to bring you with me." After hanging up, he stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. In his mind, the Suburban was still there, waiting, challenging him. He knew he could fix it, he knew exactly what to do, but he also knew that getting involved where he wasn't wanted could cost him the only job he had gotten in months. Finally, around midnight, he made a decision that would change everything. Wednesday dawned with a light drizzle that transformed the streets of Guadalajara into shiny mirrors. Miguel arrived at the workshop with his thermos of coffee and a determination he hadn't felt in months. He had spent the night awake, not out of anxiety, but out of meticulous planning. He knew his window of opportunity was narrow. Don Armando would be coming on Friday, and if the problem wasn't solved by then, the workshop would lose not only an important customer, but also its reputation. Roberto was visibly stressed. Chuy and the fat guy were working long hours trying to find the solution, and the tension in the air was palpable. Miguel began his cleaning routine as usual, but this time he observed everything with analytical attention. The mechanics' schedules when they took their breaks, when they went out to eat, the moments when the workshop was empty or minimally supervised. Roberto spent most of his time in his office answering calls from dissatisfied customers and reviewing the precarious financial situation of the business. Mid-morning, while sweeping near the SUV, he heard Roberto talking on the phone with Don Armando. "I promise you it will be ready by Friday, Don Armando." "Yes, sir. I understand the urgency. My best men are working on it." "No, sir. It won't be necessary to take it to another workshop." "Yes, sir. See you Friday." When Roberto hung up, he left his office with a red face and walked straight over to Chewy, who was under another vehicle. "Any progress?" he asked tensely. "Nothing, boss," Chewy replied, rolling out from under the car. "We've tried everything. This is like looking for a needle in a haystack." "Well, find that needle, Chewy, because if we don't deliver that truck on Friday, we're screwed." Roberto returned to his office, slamming the door behind him. The fat man and Javier exchanged worried glances. Miguel continued sweeping, but his decision was already made. At noon, when everyone went out to lunch, Miguel stayed in the workshop with the excuse of wanting to get a head start on Friday's deep cleaning. Roberto gave him a nod of approval before leaving. As soon as the doors closed and the workshop fell silent, Miguel took action. He walked over to the SUV with determined steps, opened the hood, and began to work with the precision of someone who has done this 1,000 times before. He knew exactly what to look for. He located the ignition coils and began to perform a resistance test with a multimeter he had seen in Chewy's toolbox. He worked quickly but meticulously, aware that he had perhaps 40 minutes before someone returned. The third coil he checked showed an abnormal reading. It was subtle, barely noticeable. The type of intermittent failure that only appears under specific temperature and load conditions was exactly what he had suspected. The problem wasn't the coil itself, but a micro crack in the connector that caused an intermittent signal interruption. Miguel felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was immediately accompanied by a dilemma. If he simply fixed the problem now, it would be too obvious. The mechanics would realize that someone had worked on the vehicle. But if he did nothing and Friday arrived without a solution, the workshop would face serious consequences. He made a compromise, mentally documenting the exact problem and returning all the tools to their place. He cleaned up any traces of his intervention and walked away from the vehicle just as he heard voices approaching. Chewy and the fat guy were returning from lunch. "Still here, buddy?" asked the fat guy in surprise. "Yes, I want to get ahead with my work," Miguel replied casually, continuing with his broom. The rest of the day passed normally. Miguel watched discreetly as the mechanics continued to try to diagnose the Suburban without success. Each failed attempt increased the collective frustration. Javier even suggested calling a specialized technician from the agency, but Roberto rejected the idea because of the cost involved. That night, Miguel could barely eat dinner. In his room, he drew up a detailed plan. He needed to find the perfect moment to fix the vehicle without being seen, but in a way that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. The solution came to him around midnight. On Thursday night, after everyone had left, he could return to the workshop. But there was a problem. The workshop was locked, and Roberto was the only one with the key. Miguel needed another way to get in. Thursday passed like the day before. The tension in the workshop was almost palpable. Roberto was irritable, yelling at Javier over a minor mistake. Chuy and the fat guy worked in silence, their frustration evident in every movement. The SUV remained there like a monument to collective failure. During his lunch break, Miguel went for a walk around the neighborhood. He had noticed something interesting the day before. One of the windows in the workshop bathroom didn't close properly. It had a broken latch that only appeared to be secure. Anyone with a little skill could open it from the outside. That afternoon, while cleaning the bathroom, he discreetly checked the window. Sure enough, the latch was broken. It could be opened with just a little pressure in the right place. That was his way in. At 5:30 in the afternoon, when he finished his shift, Miguel said goodbye as usual and left the workshop, but he didn't go straight to his room. Instead, he walked to a nearby hardware store and bought a new connector for the ignition coil, using almost all the money he had left until his first paycheck. He put the part in his pocket and returned to his room to wait. The hours passed agonizingly slowly. Miguel tried to rest, but his nervousness prevented him. He checked his phone constantly, watching the hours go by. 7, 8, 9 p.m. At 10:30, when the streets began to empty and Guadalajara entered its quieter nighttime routine, Miguel left his room. He walked through the streets lit by yellowish streetlights, passing by cantinas where live music could be heard, and small grocery stores that stayed open 24 hours a day. In his pocket, he carried a small flashlight, the new connector, and his determination. He arrived at the workshop around 11 p.m. The street was deserted, except for a couple of stray dogs that watched him indifferently before continuing on their way. Miguel walked to the back of the building where the bathroom window was located. His heart was pounding as he applied pressure to the exact spot on the latch. The window gave way with a soft click. Miguel paused, breathing deeply. This was the point of no return. If he went in and was discovered, not only would he lose his job, but he would probably face charges of trespassing. But if he did nothing, the workshop would go under, and with it any hope that Roberto would eventually recognize his true talent. He thought of Carolina, of the promises he had made to her, of the life he wanted to build for her. He pushed himself up and slid through the window into the dark bathroom. The interior of the workshop was plunged into almost complete darkness, broken only by the dim light of an outside street lamp filtering through the dirty windows. Miguel turned on his flashlight, casting a circle of light that danced on the walls as he moved cautiously from the bathroom to the main area of the workshop. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic drip of a poorly closed faucet and the distant hum of nighttime traffic. Miguel felt a mixture of adrenaline and fear as he approached the black SUV. The vehicle seemed more imposing in the darkness, a massive silhouette casting long shadows on the oil-stained floor. He worked with methodical precision. First, he placed rags around the work area to catch any tools that might fall and make noise. Then he carefully opened the hood, making sure the support rod was securely in place. The light from his flashlight illuminated the engine, and for a moment he felt the familiar thrill of facing a mechanical challenge. He located the problematic coil he had identified the day before. With confident but delicate movements, he disconnected the faulty cable. The connector showed clear signs of thermal stress, and the microcrack he had diagnosed was barely visible, even with the flashlight shining directly on it. Any mechanic who didn't know exactly what to look for would have missed it. Miguel took the new connector out of his pocket and began the installation process. His hands, weathered by years of experience, moved with the confidence of a surgeon. He connected the cables in the correct sequence, making sure each connection was secure and well insulated. He applied a dielectric compound to the contact points to prevent future moisture problems. As he worked, his mind wandered to his previous life in Monterey. He remembered the long days at the agency, the pride he felt when he solved complex problems that other technicians couldn't, the congratulations from his supervisors, the bonuses for excellence in service. All of that had disappeared in an instant when the economic crisis hit and the mass layoffs began. It had been devastating, not only because of the financial loss, but also because of the loss of identity. Being a mechanic wasn't just his job, it was who he was. And now, crouched in the darkness of someone else's workshop, making repairs on the sly like a thief, he felt the bitter irony of his situation. He finished installing the connector and checked all the connections once more. Then he performed a continuity test with the multimeter he had borrowed from the toolbox. The numbers on the digital display confirmed that the connection was perfect. The resistance was exactly as it should be. But Miguel didn't stop there. His trained eye noticed other small details that could cause problems in the future. An air filter that was starting to clog, a vacuum hose with a small crack that would eventually cause failures. He decided to address these minor issues as well, leaving the engine in optimal condition. He worked for almost 2 hours, completely absorbed in his task. The outside world ceased to exist. It was just him, the engine, and the challenge of bringing that machine back to life. It was therapeutic, almost meditative. For the first time in months, Miguel felt like himself again. When he was finally finished, he carefully closed the hood and put all the tools away, exactly where he had found them. He cleaned up any trace of his presence with obsessive meticulousness. Then he returned to the bathroom, climbed out the window, and closed it from the outside, making sure the latch returned to its seemingly closed position. It was almost 2 a.m. when Miguel began his walk back home. The streets of Guadalajara were now truly empty, with only a few taxis circulating in search of last-minute passengers. He passed a taco stand that was closing, and the owner offered him the last tacos at a reduced price. Miguel politely declined. Even though his stomach was growling with hunger, he couldn't spend money unnecessarily. Back in his room, he collapsed onto the cot with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had done his part. The SUV was fixed, but now came the hardest part, waiting to see what would happen when the mechanics tested the vehicle. The next day, he tried to sleep, but his mind would not shut down. He went over every step of the repair, mentally checking that he hadn't made any mistakes, that he hadn't left any evidence. What if they realized that someone had worked on the vehicle, And what if Roberto checked the security cameras? Then he remembered with relief that he had noticed that the workshop didn't have security cameras, just a fake deterrent sign at the entrance. Finally, near dawn, exhaustion overcame his anxiety, and he fell into a restless sleep. Friday dawned with a clear, bright sky. Miguel arrived at the workshop at 7 o'clock sharp, as usual, but this time with a different tension in his chest. Roberto was already there, pacing nervously in front of his office. Chewy and the fat guy arrived shortly after with grim expressions. "Good morning," Miguel greeted them, trying to sound casual. The mechanics barely responded, focused on preparing for another day of frustrated attempts with the SUV. Miguel began his cleaning routine, but his ears were attentive to every word, every movement. It was Javier who, almost by accident, decided to give the vehicle one last chance before Don Armando arrived in the afternoon. "Boss, can I try to start it one more time?" asked the young mechanic. "Just to check if, I don't know, maybe something had changed with the weather or something." "Do whatever you want," Roberto growled, his voice devoid of hope. "Anyway, there's nothing to lose now." Javier climbed into the Suburban and inserted the key into the ignition. Miguel, who was sweeping a few feet away, felt his heart race. This was the moment of truth. Javier turned the key. The engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful sound, without the hesitation and intermittent glitches that had plagued the vehicle for weeks. The noise made everyone in the workshop stop immediately. "What?" muttered Chewy, dropping the tool he was holding. "It started!" shouted Javier, his voice filled with disbelief. The engine started. Roberto ran out of his office. The fat man approached the vehicle with his mouth open. Chewy circled the truck, examining it as if it had performed magic on its own. "Leave it running," Roberto ordered. "Let's see if it stays running." 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The engine continued to run perfectly with a steady, smooth purr. There were no hesitations, no misfires, nothing except a perfectly tuned engine doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "I don't understand," Chewy said, scratching his head. "We literally didn't do anything different yesterday. How is this possible?" "Maybe something settled," suggested the fat man. "Or maybe we had a loose connection that finally made contact." Miguel continued sweeping, keeping his head down, but a small smile played on his lips. No one noticed. Everyone was too busy celebrating the inexplicable mechanical miracle. Roberto personally checked every system in the vehicle. He accelerated, verified that all the revs were stable. He tested the air conditioning, the lights, everything. The Suburban was running like new. "I don't know what happened, but I'm not going to question good luck," Roberto finally declared with a massive sigh of relief. "Get it ready for delivery this afternoon. Chewy, make sure you do a complete test drive before Don Armando arrives." The rest of the morning passed in a completely different atmosphere. The tension had been replaced by an air of cautious celebration. The mechanics joked among themselves. The music played louder. Even Roberto seemed more relaxed. Miguel continued with his cleaning work, staying in the shadows, watching his work from a distance with silent satisfaction. Don Armando Villalobos arrived at the Hernandez workshop at exactly 3 p.m. on Friday, driving a shiny black Mercedes-Benz that stood in stark contrast to the more modest vehicles parked on the street. He was a tall, distinguished 60-year-old man with perfectly combed gray hair, a dark gray tailored suit, and Italian shoes that probably cost more than Miguel's monthly salary. His presence exuded authority and success. Roberto came out to greet him with a mixture of relief and nervousness, wiping his hands on a rag before extending his hand in greeting. "Don Armando, welcome. Your truck is ready." "It better be, Roberto," Don Armando replied in a serious but not hostile tone. "I need to leave for Puerto Vallarta in 2 hours." Chewy had parked the Suburban in front of the workshop, washed and polished until it gleamed in the afternoon sun. Don Armando walked around the vehicle, inspecting it with a critical eye. Then he climbed into the driver's seat. Roberto slid into the passenger seat. "What was the problem, finally?" "Aye?" Don Armando asked as he turned the key. The engine started immediately, smooth as silk. "It was an intermittent problem with the ignition system," Roberto explained, using vagueness to cover up the fact that he was still not entirely sure what had fixed the problem. "Very difficult to diagnose because it didn't generate error codes, but we fixed it." Don Armando accelerated, listening carefully to the sound of the engine, checked the dashboard indicators, tested the air conditioning, and switched between different transmission modes. Everything worked perfectly. Impressive, he finally admitted. I must confess that I was considering taking it to the dealership if you guys couldn't fix it, but this is better than new. Well done, Roberto. They took it for a 15-minute test drive through the surrounding streets. The Suburban responded perfectly to every command, accelerating smoothly, braking without any problems, and handling curves with stability. Don Armando drove in silence, but his body language expressed satisfaction. Back at the workshop, the businessman parked the SUV and got out with a genuine smile. Excellent work. How much do I owe you? Roberto had prepared a detailed invoice. Labor, parts replaced during the 3 weeks of diagnosis, lubricants, fluids. He handed the document to Don Armando, who quickly reviewed it and nodded. Do you accept transfers? Of course, sir. As Don Armando made the payment from his phone, Roberto felt the weight of the last few weeks finally lift from his shoulders. This payment would not only cover the overdue bills, but it would also keep the shop's reputation intact. Don Armando put away his phone and shook Roberto's hand firmly. You have been my trusted workshop for 10 years, Roberto. I'm glad you're still as good as ever. Thank you for your trust, Don Armando. Have a good trip to Puerto Vallarta. The businessman said goodbye, got into his SUV, and drove away. Roberto watched the vehicle until it disappeared into the Guadalajara traffic. Then he turned to his mechanics with a broad smile. We did it, guys. Chuy, Gordo, Javier, good job. Today, the beers are on me after closing. The mechanics celebrated with cheers and pats on the back. Miguel, who had watched everything from a distance while organizing tools in the warehouse, smiled to himself. His work had saved the shop, even if no one knew it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a festive atmosphere. 2 other customers even showed up, having heard that the shop had finally solved the case of the impossible Suburban and left their vehicles for minor services. Roberto's reputation had remained intact, even strengthened, but the universe has curious ways of revealing secrets. The following Monday, when Miguel arrived at the workshop as usual, he found Roberto and Chuy having a serious conversation near the work area. The fat man was nearby, looking confused. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Good morning, Miguel greeted them, immediately sensing that something was out of place. Miguel, come here a moment, Roberto called in a neutral tone. Miguel approached, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Had they figured it out? Had he left any evidence? Do you know anything about mechanics? Roberto asked directly, looking at him intently. Miguel's heart stopped for a second. I know a little, sir. I've worked before in... The fat guy found this morning, Roberto interrupted, holding up the old connector that Miguel had replaced. It was at the bottom of Chuy's toolbox. None of us remember putting it there. And when I inspected it more closely, I realized it's the connector for the coil in the Suburban. Miguel. He swallowed hard. He hadn't counted on the fat man organizing the toolboxes over the weekend. So I checked the Suburban more carefully, Roberto continued, and found that it has a new connector on coil number 3, a connector that we didn't put there. In fact, we hadn't even identified that as the problem. The silence that followed was thick. Chuy looked at Miguel with a mixture of surprise and something that could be respect. The fat guy looked confused. Javier, who had just arrived, watched the scene without understanding what was happening. Was it you? Roberto asked. His voice was without hostility, but demanding honesty. Miguel made a decision at that moment. Lying would only get him so far, and he was tired of hiding. Yes, sir. It was me, he admitted, raising his head to look Roberto directly in the eye. On Thursday night, I climbed in through the bathroom window and repaired the vehicle. How did you know what the problem was? Chuy asked, stepping forward. We check everything, the micro crack in the connector, Miguel explained. It's a known problem in these models. It causes intermittent failures that don't generate error codes because the interruption is too brief. You need a specific stress test under load to detect it. Roberto crossed his arms, studying Miguel with new intensity. And why on earth would a cleaner know how to do stress tests under load? Miguel took a deep breath and decided to tell the whole truth. Because I'm not just a cleaner, sir. I'm a mechanic. I worked for 15 years at a car dealership in Monterey, specializing in electrical diagnostics and injection systems. I lost my job when the crisis hit and the dealership made massive cuts. I came to Guadalajara looking for work as a mechanic. But no one was hiring. I had a daughter to support and my money was running out. When I saw your ad for a cleaner, I took it because it was better than nothing. But when I saw the problem with the Suburban and heard how important it was for you to fix it, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The confession hung in the air. Roberto said nothing for several seconds that felt like an eternity. Miguel braced himself for the worst, to be fired, perhaps to face trespassing charges. But what happened next took him completely by surprise. Roberto began to laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a genuine laugh of disbelief and relief. So I hired an experienced mechanic to sweep floors, Roberto said, shaking his head. And that mechanic fixed in one night what my guys couldn't fix in 3 weeks. Chewy also smiled, albeit with some professional embarrassment. Buddy, you made us look bad, he said, but without any real malice in his voice. But you have to teach us how you spotted that problem. Why didn't you say you were a mechanic from the start? Asked the fat guy. Because I needed the job. Miguel replied honestly. Simple. And I thought that if I said I was a mechanic but accepted a cleaning job, you guys would think I was a bad mechanic. I preferred to keep my mouth shut and prove my worth in another way if the opportunity arose. Roberto approached Miguel and put a hand on his shoulder. Miguel, what you did was technically trespassing and could get me in trouble if anyone found out. But you also saved my business and my reputation. So here's my proposal. Forget about the cleaning job. From now on, you're the official mechanic at the shop. Same starting salary as Javier, but with the possibility of a raise when you prove how good you really are. Deal. Miguel felt tears welling up, but he held them back. He extended his hand and shook Roberto's firmly. Deal, boss. You won't regret it. You better, Roberto replied with a smile. And another thing, teach these guys that diagnostic trick. There are clearly things they don't know. The following months completely transformed Miguel's life. He proved to be not only a competent mechanic, but an exceptional one. His ability to quickly diagnose complex problems quickly became legendary in the neighborhood. Customers began specifically requesting Miguel to check their vehicles. Roberto raised his salary twice in the first 3 months. With the extra money, Miguel was able to move to a more decent apartment and finally bring Carolina from Monterrey. The girl quickly adapted to Guadalajara, enrolling in a good school near her new home. The Hernandez workshop prospered as never before. The combination of Chuy and El Gordo's experience with Miguel's advanced technical knowledge created a formidable team. Even Javier improved dramatically under Miguel's mentorship, who enjoyed teaching as much as he enjoyed repairing. Don Armando Villalobos became a regular customer and recommended the shop to his business contacts. The business's reputation spread beyond the neighborhood, attracting customers from all over the city. One afternoon, 6 months after that memorable Friday, Roberto called Miguel into his office. The boss was sitting behind his desk, but this time there were no unpaid bills or expressions of stress. Sit down, Miguel, Roberto invited him. Miguel took a seat, curious but not nervous. His relationship with Roberto had evolved from boss and employee to something more like a partnership. I've been thinking, Roberto began. This workshop has grown a lot in recent months, and much of that growth is thanks to you. I'm reaching an age where I want to work fewer hours, maybe travel a bit with my wife before we get too old. We all deserve to enjoy life, boss, Miguel said with a smile. That's why I want to make you an offer, Roberto continued. I want you to become the workshop's technical supervisor. That means a significant pay raise, commissions for specialized work, and eventually, if things continue to go well, the possibility of becoming a partner in the business. Miguel was speechless. He had arrived in Guadalajara 6 months ago with barely enough money to survive a week, desperate and defeated, and now he was being offered not only stability, but a future. I don't know what to say, boss, he finally murmured. Say yes, Roberto replied with a smile. And stop calling me boss. If we're going to be partners someday, you'd better start calling me Roberto. Miguel extended his hand once more, but this time Roberto hugged him instead of shaking it. Thank you, Roberto, for giving me this opportunity, for trusting me. You earned it, Miguel. Ever since that night, you climbed through the bathroom window to fix a car that no one else could. They both laughed at the memory of that risky night that had changed everything. That night, Miguel walked back to his apartment as the sun set over Guadalajara, painting the sky orange and purple. The streets were alive with the city's characteristic energy. Street vendors were closing their stalls, families were dining at outdoor taquerias, and mariachis were playing in a nearby plaza. When he got home, Carolina was doing her homework at the dining room table. She looked up when he entered, smiling broadly. "Dad, how was your day?" Miguel sat down next to her and told her about Roberto's proposal, about the future that was opening up before them. Carolina hugged him tightly, and Miguel felt that finally, after months of uncertainty and struggle, it had all been worth it. "Do you know what I learned from all this, my love?" he said to his daughter. "That sometimes in life you have to start from the bottom, even when you know you are worth more. But if you work hard, if you maintain your integrity, and take advantage of every opportunity to prove your worth, eventually the truth comes out. And you also learn to climb in through windows," Carolina joked. Miguel laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair affectionately. "That was a special occasion. But yes, I also learned that sometimes you have to take calculated risk to change your destiny." Later that night, as Carolina slept in her room and Miguel sat on the small balcony of his apartment, watching the lights of Guadalajara spread out to the horizon, he reflected on the extraordinary journey he had experienced. He had arrived as a defeated stranger and was now an integral part of a community. He had accepted a humble job when his professional pride screamed that he deserved more, and that humility had opened doors that pride would have kept closed. He had risked everything on a dark night, not for personal glory, but because he couldn't stand idly by when he had the ability to help. And in the end, the truth had emerged in the most unexpected way, taking him not only back to his profession, but beyond where he had been before. Miguel smiled as he remembered the black SUV that had changed everything, the vehicle that no one could repair until a simple cleaner slipped away into the night with knowledge, determination, and a poorly closed window. At the Hernandez workshop, the lights were still on. Roberto was working late, reviewing the expansion plans that were now possible thanks to the growth of the business. Chewy and the Fat Man had developed a new respect for the detailed technical diagnosis Miguel was teaching them. Javier was becoming an exceptional mechanic under the right mentorship. And it had all started with a simple cleaning job ad on a corner pole, a desperate decision, and the courage of a man who knew who he was, even when the world told him to start from scratch. Guadalajara, with its chaotic warmth and endless possibilities, had given Miguel more than a new beginning. It had given him a second chance to prove himself, a community to cherish, a future to build, and confirmation that true talent, combined with humility and determination, always finds a way to shine. The cleaner who was a mechanic, the mechanic who became a supervisor, the man who risked everything to do the right thing. This was the story of Miguel Angel Soto, and it was just beginning.